What you see here is a view of Wrigley Field, and specifically left field. Medical advances and cures seem to frequently come out of left field, but many great innovations aren't even in the ballpark. The ballpark in this analogy is top-tier university laboratories, pharmaceutical companies, and large government agencies, such as the NIH. What I'd like to show you are brilliant ideas that developed down the block or in the next town over. Down that block, we might find a high school kid in a baseball shirt with half his attention on his science teacher and the other half on his magazine. That kid, Jack Andraka, was able to develop a screening test for pancreatic cancer by melding the knowledge from two different disciplines: an engineering article on carbon nanotubes and a lecture on cancer. As you can imagine, it was hard to get anyone to listen to this idea because, after all, he was definitely outside the ballpark. Let's leave that ballpark once again and go to the proverbial next town over. Actually, it's a few countries over. And this is Dr. Alfred Sommer. He went to Africa to do field work and help those with night blindness by giving vitamin A shots. That was within the framework of what was expected, what was known. He changed things by going off script, and here's how he did that. First off, he was faced with a shipment that was not suitable for injection and decided to try it orally. It worked and cost pennies and saved the vision of many children. What's even more remarkable is that one Christmas holiday, he was looking over numbers from one of his studies, and he realized that the group that did not get vitamin A was not following up. He thought outside the box and was later proven correct, despite a lot of resistance, that without vitamin A, not only was night blindness a problem, but overall mortality was huge in the control group. To this date, Dr. Sommer is probably one of the only ophthalmologists that can claim to have saved millions of lives. I like to refer to these past two ideas as April to December ideas. Originally, I became familiar with this idea from the Freakonomics books of Steve Levitt and Stephen Dubner. Essentially, they had looked at birth dates of children who had excelled at the highest level of soccer and the highest level of hockey. And they realized that all their birth dates tend to cluster around January, February, and March. And this was primarily an artificial designation caused by cutoff dates. Essentially, if you put a 5-year, 0-day-old child up against a 5-year, 364-day-old child in a soccer competition, more often than not, the older child will excel. And then once you cherry pick that child from that group, they get elite coaching and elite training, which brings them to the pinnacle of success. The only problem here is that 3/4 of the talent pool gets ignored by this selection process. A similar thing happens within the biotech and pharmaceutical field. The way we've been doing it is selecting out 25% of the good ideas, while the other 75% of the ideas are left to fend for themselves at the edges, outside the ballpark. I'm here to tell you of one of those April to December ideas. Back in college and medical school, I was a sponge, trying to use my newfound knowledge of biochemistry to understand what was known about diseases. Back then there was no internet, but it was being developed just to the right of this picture at the University of Illinois. So the only sources we had were essentially books. And the Merck Manual was a book that presented all known diseases in a very concise format. But when it came to what caused diseases, the word idiopathic would come up a lot. And this word, I later learned, meant we have no idea. And that was frustrating, but it was also exciting at the same time because there was room for discovery. When I went on to residency, I had a residency research project that changed everything. I was given the opportunity to examine 2 clusters of children with a blood-borne cancer, like leukemia, lymphoma. And these 2 groups of children were linked by a common family. And so the thought was, let's look at that family and try to come up with a possible infectious trigger that had been suggested in the epidemiology, but which no one had found. So we looked at whether the family used a certain fertilizer, whether they had a smelter in their backyard, whether high power lines were in the area. And then we also looked at infections that one child could bring to the others. And then when looking at infections, we would look systematically. Was it a virus? Was it a bacteria? Was it a fungus? Was it an atypical bacteria? In this last group, atypical bacteria are what caught my attention. When looking at childhood leukemia, you can see that there's a peak at about age 3. And oddly, there is a atypical mycobacterial infection where children develop enlarged lymph nodes at about 3.6 years of age. This seemed to really spark my interest as a link between these 2 diagnoses. I ran this by a friend of mine, Dr. Kelly Lund, and she stated that there is a peak in type 1 diabetes incidence at the same age. There's actually a bimodal peak for type 1 diabetes. And this would correspond to the first bump in incidence. So this was really intriguing that all of these things were lining up. When looked at microscopically, and you look at the literature as far as what causes type 1 diabetes if you're looking for triggers, multiple sclerosis comes up a lot as well. Certainly there's not a peak at 3 years, but when one examines the world map, it's quite interesting that the incidence goes up the further from the equator one goes. So here we have 3 diseases: childhood ALL, multiple sclerosis, and type 1 diabetes that are loosely linked to atypical bacteria in the medical literature, and there's some correlations with age of onset for at least 2 of the 3. It became apparent that if you look at the medical evidence for triggers for these diseases in particular, one can find just a handful of agents that could be responsible, or at least have a modicum of evidence showing some link. This seemed to be a lot more manageable than looking at, say, the whole microbiome of 10,000 organisms and trying to sort through each of those. So from this, an idea was spawned, essentially looking at the equation that a disease is equal to genetics plus environmental factors. And knowing that genetics is something that we're not going to be able to change, it seemed that if we could make some evidentiary links to infectious agents, here depicted as Agent Z, Agent Y, or Agent X, then we would have options for vaccinations, options for antibiotics, as well as public health options of minimizing that bacteria or that bacterial source. Here's a grid showing some shorthand, but you can see how one could line up columns with diseases such as multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, JRA, common childhood ALL, and you could have rows, Agent Z, Agent Y, Agent X, and you could cross-link the available medical literature to see how much evidence there was for each. The beautiful thing about this idea is that there's a mouse model for each of these diseases, and there's a vaccine that's already existing for each of these agents. They simply need to be brought together in a systematic fashion. if any links are found, then we're off to the races with trials using those vaccines. One question that often comes up is, vaccines are largely thought of as a preventative agent when you don't have any disease burden whatsoever. But there are very interesting studies that show that for type 1 diabetes, a vaccinating type agent can reverse a chronic disease. It would be great if this same type of thing could happen with MS, where vaccinating mid-disease progression could reverse the disease itself. This certainly would be true for all of the other progressive autoimmune diseases as well. The cost of a vaccine would be phenomenally less expensive once developed, I predict, than the current costs. The annual cost of treatment for multiple sclerosis in this country is $28 billion. It's easier to understand that per person, $70,000 is what families, individuals, insurances have to pay to get treatment. Type 1 diabetes is at $14 billion nationally. One of the more exciting things is when you look at these April to December ideas, such as the Agent Z project, you compare them against the competition. And when one looks at the competition's record to date, it is simply zero. Zero cures for any of these diseases. So they're not even on the board, and it's very reasonable that these ideas should be funded and should work. So please join us in venturing off the path, out of the ballpark, and potentially help millions of people by doing so. Thank you.